Hi and welcome to this event in the Royal Institute of Dundee Branch Philosophy Speaker Series. That's the full title of the thing. Precise, I guess. My name is Frank Ruger. I'm here at the University of Dundee, Professor of Modern and Contemporary Philosophy, and I'm very pleased to host our guest, whom I will introduce in a second. Just a bit of a technicality at the beginning. I will give the floor to Tim Ingold after telling you all the things you don't need to know about him, because you already know them. And then Tim will speak for a while. And after this, we have the possibility and the great opportunity to discuss with him. For people following online, ideally you put your comments or questions in the chat and I will read them out loud. As there will be a zillion, I might probably start to select quite early on which one I read. It's not, and blame my idiosyncrasies and my stupidities if you think I didn't select the right ones. So, Tim Ingold. Did his PhD, 1976, Cambridge, John Barnes. Moved to University of Manchester in 1919. 1919. Appointed the Max Gluckman Professor of Social Anthropology in 1995. He then moved in 1999 to Aberdeen, where he helped to establish and found the, I think it's still the youngest department of anthropology in the UK as Professor of Social Anthropology. He is, I'm just referring to these two titles. He's a fellow of the British Academy and of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. If I were to tell you about all the articles that Tim has published, we would be here for, well, longer than time, I guess. So I will just select and tell you something about some of his books. In 1980, he published Hunters, Pastorials, and Ranchers, Reindeer Economies and Their Transformation with Cambridge University Press. In 1986, Evolution and Social Life, also with Cambridge University Press, reissued in 2016 in the classic text in anthropology series with a new preface, and that already indicates some symbolic weight and efficiency. In 2000, The Perception of the Environment, Essays on Livelihood, Dwelling, and Skill with Routledge. And I'm leaving huge gaps. The productivity of Tim is, as you know, absolutely impressive. In 2007, Lines, A Brief History, again with Routledge and reissued with a new preface in 2016. In 2015, The Life of Lines, again with Routledge. Tim came in, I think, in 2018, emeritus. And just an indication of the productivity of an emeritus, as an indication for the productivity of an emeritus, I just want to read you the last three publications, three book publications. In 2020, with Cambridge, with Polity Correspondences. In 2021, Machiavel chez les Babouins pour une anthropologie au-delà de l'humain, which is a translation of a selection of his articles. And in 2021, Imagining for Real, Essays on Creation, Attention, and Correspondence with Routledge. I think the newest one, the most recent book publication, has some resonance with what Tim will be talking about today. I give the floor to you. His title is On Not Knowing and Paying Attention, How to Walk in a Possible World. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Frank. Pleasure to join you. Once as a boy of 8 or 9, I think, I was walking home from school along a path I always took. On one side, trees and bushes lined the way, on the other, fields of wheat. Ahead, I saw a rod-like object poking out between the bushes. Was it the barrel of a gun? Terrified, I crept forward and found a man there. Tall and thin he was, and full of beard. "What are you doing?" I asked of him. It was a telescope. "I'm looking at the moon," he said, and the moon looked back. Now, this incident from my childhood has always stayed with me, and it surfaced again as I was listening to conversations on walking at a workshop in the spectacular setting of the Ingold Peninsula in southwest Ireland. Seated in the audience, while I should have been diligently taking notes, I found myself penning that little poem instead, which I just read to you. And when it was my turn to speak, I began with it. And somehow it seemed to encapsulate everything I wanted to say about the wisdom that lies in taking the time to observe, about how the inherent uncertainty and anticipation with which we creep forward in life can nevertheless open to immense possibility, about the correspondence of generations in the meeting of young minds and old, and about what it takes for eyes to light up in wonder and astonishment, and about what all this means for an education that, beyond the stultification of the school classroom, truly opens our eyes to the world around us. So these are my topics in what follows. The poet T.S. Eliot, in his Choruses from the Rock, included these lines: "Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information?" So has wisdom somehow dissolved into knowledge? And has knowledge dissolved into information? Could it be possible that we know too much, or that we have too much information? Never in the history of the world, it seems, has such a wealth of knowledge and such riches of information been married to such poverty of wisdom. In a land where knowledge is king and information is castle, wisdom, it seems, is held in contempt. Because knowledge and wisdom are not at all the same and may indeed operate at cross purposes. And to show why they're different, I want to introduce another distinction between the self and the soul. The self is an invention of modern thought. Its source lies in the identification of the person I am with an interior intelligence to which only I have immediate access. This self thinks, reflects, forms its own theories about what might be out there, or of the thinking of other selves hidden from me as I am from them. It considers its options and delivers its intentions. But it cannot in itself engage in lively intercourse with the real world. That is left to the body, which furnishes the self with its physical sensory apparatus. So we have the classic view here. Here's the self inside. Here's the body around there, and here's the world. Self can only interact with the world via the body. Now, the soul, at least in the sense I'm using it, is an idea of far more ancient provenance and retains its force among peoples around the world as yet uncrushed by the modernist juggernaut. And what these peoples tell us is that the soul, far from being locked up within a bodily casing, is, like the air we breathe, the anima, cast upon the current of life. It's a churn or a vortex wherein life's incessant movement is momentarily pulled aside, deflected from its course and wound up on itself. So it's like this, I'm going along, I deflect, I get into an eddy, and then I go on. So that's the soul, that's the self. And as such, the soul is a site not of intention, but of affectation, a concentration of energy and vitality, which, like a coiled spring, holds within its torque the memory of its lively formation. or as the late philosopher Michel Serres writes, bearing his own soul, I am myself a deviation and my soul declines. My global body is open adrift. It slips irreversibly on the slope. Who am I? A vortex, that says. Now, as the self is distinguished from the soul, so knowledge is distinguished from wisdom. The self, in carving out a place for itself in the world, seeks the safety and security of established positions. So every increment of knowledge adds another stone to the walls with which it shores itself up against the barrage of physical externality. And so knowledge breeds inattention as the self is driven ever further within a citadel of its own making. The soul, by contrast, is radically open to the world, but is also defenseless, and therein lies its wisdom. So whereas knowledge treats the world as its object, for wisdom, the world is its milieu. Knowing is about fixing things within the concepts and categories of thought. Wisdom unfixes and unsettles. To know is to have things accounted for, explained away, or embedded in context, so they no longer trouble us. To be wise is to bring things back into the fullness of presence, to pay attention, and to care. So knowing is rational and intellectual, wisdom is relational and affective. Knowledge has its challenges, wisdom has its ways, but where the challenges of knowledge close in on their solutions, the ways of wisdom open out to a process of life. So where knowledge protects, wisdom exposes. Where knowledge makes us safe, wisdom makes us vulnerable. Knowledge empowers, wisdom does not. But what wisdom loses in power, it gains in existential strength. Because while knowledge may hold the world to account, it's wisdom that brings it to life. Now, that's not to say that we can do without knowledge. That would be absurd. It is rather a matter of balance. And at the present juncture, it seems to me that the scales have tipped precipitously towards knowledge at wisdom's expense. So our question is, how can the balance be restored? It's one thing, after all, to investigate the moon, map its features, unlock its materials, speculate on its origins. But it is quite another to take possession of it. We're here on this planet, after all, at the moon's behest, and the wise course is to open our eyes to it and bid welcome to its radiance, because we can only experience the moon in the shining of its light. The Scottish poet Andrew Gregg has this to say on the matter. Sometimes, he says, the more you know, the less you see. What you encounter is your knowledge, not the thing itself. Might we then see more, experience more, come closer to the truth of things, be a little wiser by knowing less? Blinded by knowledge, we often fail to see what is right before our eyes. We attend to things only so far as it is necessary to accommodate them within the compartments of thought, so that they can be ticked off, accounted for, understood, laid to rest. But truly to attend is to bring things to presence, not to discover the truth about them, but to discover the truth that comes from them in the experience. And that's the truth of wisdom. It lies not in objective fact or in what scientists treat as data, nor will we come any closer to it by gathering more information, because the truth of wisdom lies beyond the facts. Now, it's hardly surprising that in a world where facts often appear divorced from any kind of observation, where they can be invented on a whim, propagated through mass media, and manipulated to suit the interests of the powerful, regardless of their veracity, it's natural that we should be anxious about the fate of truth. And to many, it seems that in this era of post-truth, we are cast adrift without an anchor. And we are right to insist that there can be no proper facts without observation. But I believe we are wrong to jump to the conclusion that truth is limited to the facts, to what can be objectively ascertained. The facts of a case, for example, may prove the criminal guilty, yet the truth of guilt will ever be tested in the trials of conscience and in the affectations of the soul. Guilt is as such unfathomable, and no amount of additional information will get to the bottom of it. So there's more to observation than objectivity, because to observe it is not enough merely to look at things. We have to join with them and to follow. And it's precisely as observation goes beyond objectivity that truth goes beyond the facts. This is the moment in our observations when the things we study begin to tell us how to observe. In allowing ourselves into their presence, rather than holding them at arm's length, that is, in attending to them, we find that they are also guiding our attention. And attending to these waves, we also respond to them, and they respond to us. Study then becomes a practice of what I'll call correspondence and of care. It's a labor of love, giving back what we owe to the world for our own existence as beings within it. But wisdom means taking our counsel from the world itself. It's to turn towards the world for what it has to teach us, to attend to it, and to accept in good grace what it has to give. But it is also to refute the division between data collection and theory building that underwrites normal science. In the protocols of science, data are not what the world offers to us. They're what we extract from it by force or subterfuge. And having filled our bags with data, we cut and run, turning our backs on the world in order to construct our knowledge of it. This, I think, is deeply unethical. If we are even to begin to address the problems of the world, we need to re-embed science in wisdom. So let's turn again towards the moon and allow our attention to be guided by it. Let it stir the soul, and perhaps then the moon might help us to recover that sense of enchantment, even of astonishment, which today's science has crushed beneath the heavy boots of astronautical ambition, and which the entertainment industry has branded as a wonder drug. Through all this, the moon, supremely indifferent to injury and insult, continues to shine in the sky, while we earthly beings are still here, blessed by its light, and life goes on. It's often said these days, in a tone of some regret, that we face an uncertain future. If only we could be more certain. If only we knew what fate awaits us, well, then we could plan ahead, prepare ourselves, perhaps even change things, to weed out aspects of the future we don't like and choose those we do. We could subject the future to a kind of artificial selection. But in pining for certainty, we should perhaps be careful what we wish for. After all, the one certainty we all face is that every one of us will eventually die. Yet, even if death inevitably comes to everyone, at least we die in the knowledge that generations will follow, facing their own uncertainties, just as we did. So whereas certainty augurs the dead end, uncertainty opens up the field for life to carry on. For it is a defining property of life that it continually overreaches itself. Far from running from beginning to end, every ending in life issues into new beginning. Life is pure excess. The curse of uncertainty is to present this excess as a deficit. To say that the future is uncertain is to suggest that life is not yet fully destined, that there is still work to be done to determine where it will finally lead. The word conveys a sense of incompletion, of unfinished business, of having not yet gained the full measure of the world that would yield to total predictive confidence. There are still gaps in our knowledge, missing pieces that remain to be inserted. And nowadays we look to science to complete the picture, and yet even science admits no future beyond the predictive horizons of the present. So that's why today's younger generations are less inclined to see the future as a landscape extending indefinitely into the distance than as a plateau bearing down upon them. No previous generation has been so starkly presented with the prospect of the end of history, even of life itself. The future to them seems all too certain, nor is any relief to be found in a stance of denial through regression from certainty to uncertainty. And yet, what the deficit model presents as uncertainty takes on a quite different hue in the light of excess. Then uncertainty reappears as possibility. Now, for science, radical possibility is hard to pin down. The domain of life, according to philosopher Henri Bergson, is characterized by incommensurability between what goes before and what follows. Science, Bergson argued, is simply unable to cope with this idea of the absolute originality and unforeseeability of forms. It can work only on what repeats or on what is precisely replicable. And in the language of replicability, science can only think possibility on a scale of probability. And on this scale, what cannot be determined is left to chance. Indeed, the opposition between chance and determination is deeply etched into modern thought. But it's an opposition that drains life of its creative impulse, reducing freedom to random variation within a phase space. Consider the moon. Revolving in a clockwork universe ruled by laws of gravity, it appears to continue on its determinate repetitive course. And yet, every time we open our eyes to the moon, it is as if it were for the very first time. Moonshine, at once a phenomenon of the cosmos and an illumination of the soul, never repeats. On the contrary, it brims with miraculous possibility. Now, young people with their lives ahead of them are often encouraged to think of the life course as a process of fulfilling their potential. That is a moment of progressive closure in which all possible paths are gradually narrowed down to the one actually taken, which itself at life's end reaches its ultimate conclusion. As the anthropologist Clifford Geertz put it in a now classic formulation, one of the most significant facts about us may finally be that we all begin with the natural equipment to live 1,000 kinds of life, but end in the end having lived only one. And with one's potential fulfilled, there's nowhere further to go. But what if, instead of heading towards destinations unknown, we were to push out from places already reached, along a path of renewal that knows no end? Could this be what the Pintupi, an Aboriginal people of Western Australia, meant when they told their ethnographer, Fred Myers, that life, they said, is a one possibility thing? For the Pintupi, the contours of life are those of the country in which they dwell, a country created by the ancestral beings as they moved around in the formative era known as the dreaming. Every existing creature, as the incarnation of the ancestral power from which its vitality is derived, effectively finds itself on the inside of an eternal moment of world creation. And where the ancestors led, life is bound to follow. But this isn't a movement from A to B, from a starting point to a destination. It rather carries on. Life is a one possibility thing for the Pintupi because possibility can only ever be one. The idea that people could initially be presented with multiple possibilities, like a menu of options from which to choose, only to be narrowed down as life proceeds, would make no sense to them. For Pintupi people, as they walk their desert landscape, are not fulfilling their potential, but ever replenishing it. They may indeed have more power towards the end of life than at the beginning. So how can we express this difference between possibilities and possibility, between fulfillment and replenishment? Perhaps it's analogous to the distinction between space science and amateur astronomy. Science is on a mission to reach the moon and will fire as many rockets as is necessary for the mission to be completed. But the old man, as he gazed at the moon through his telescope, had no such end in mind. His telescope proved, after all, not to be a gun. It was not as though he was shooting a line into space with his eye at one end and the moon at the other. To observe the moon for the amateur is rather to join the arc of his attention in real time with the moon's radiance. And this arc, the arc of possibility, ever replenished by the light, follows a line orthogonal to the line connecting the moon and the eye. And just it's difficult to understand, but suppose here's the eye, here's the moon, okay, and this is the line connecting the line to the moon and the eye to the moon, and here's the telescope here. But the man is not sending or shooting a line up to the moon. He's joining his attention with the moon's radiance, and that's following a line at right angles to this one. This is this then. I should perhaps have drawn it slightly circular. The arc of possibility. It's true, of course, that most of us spend our lives shooting at targets. We do first this and then that. And as with this and that, there's a degree of certainty in the ends to be achieved. Yeah, we know what we're doing. Every deed is an intentional act. And yet, in everything we do, there is also an experience we undergo. We are modified in body and mind, perhaps even transformed by the doing of it. And the question is to figure out the relation between the two, between the doing and the undergoing. This was a question that preoccupied philosopher John Dewey, most particularly in his essay of 1934 on artist's experience. Dewey asked, put undergoing inside doing, sandwiched between the original intention and its final consummation. Is undergoing something that happens to us inside the act? If undergoing were thus contained within doing, Dewey thought, there could be no continuity from one deed to the next, and life would fragment into a scatter of disconnected episodes. First I did this and I underwent something or other, then I did that and I underwent something or other, and then so one thing after another. What happens in reality, quite to the contrary, for Dewey, is that undergoing always overflows doing, to the extent that whatever you do takes into itself something of the experience of what you did before, and is in turn carried over into what you do next. With every doing, as Dewey put it in a later lecture on experience in education, with every doing, you are a somewhat different person. In short, undergoing lies precisely in the excess by which life overtakes the destinations thrown up in its wake. We could describe every act of doing by a sort of transverse connection between, let's say, an intention and an objective, and then we have another intention, and then we have another objective, and another, and then another intention with another objective. So we could say, well, I did this and I did that and I did that. Every time I started with an intention and then ended with an objective. So I for intention and O to objective. But the life of undergoing carries on in a direction orthogonal to these transverse links. So I can draw a line like this, lazy line, and I'll call it P. And that is the line of possibility. So possibilities cut across, but life as a one possibility thing is longitudinal. It goes on through. And a life tracked along this line P continually overtakes itself. It is, if you will, a life of becoming rather than being, yielding up not to objective consequences, which are really just discards left along the way, but to further possibility, not just for itself, but for all the other lives with which it tangles, including, as we'll see, its generational offspring. So critically, while every transverse line there, or every transverse connection denotes a line of intention, the longitudinal line, P, is a line of attention. Now, there are two sides to attention: exposure and attunement. And I take the idea of attunement from the ecological approach to perception pioneered by James Gibson. For Gibson, perception is about noticing things in our surroundings that might help or hinder in the furtherance of our own activity. Or in a word, it's about picking up information that specifies what these things afford. And it can be learned. One can keep on learning to perceive, Gibson writes, for as long as life goes on. For example, in the practice of a craft, skill lies in becoming sensitized to subtle variations in the material that a novice might miss. The carpenter attends to the grain of the wood, the smith to the ductility of iron. The skilled practitioner's perceptual system, in Gibson's terms, becomes, I quote, attuned to information of a certain sort. And this fine tuning of perception amounts, he says, to an education of attention. And yet in this, the momentum is entirely on the side of the perceiver. It is as if the things to be perceived were already there, laid out in the environment, merely awaiting the practitioner's attention. But what if everything is not already there? The world, after all, is not set in stone, but restless and fluid, bustling with life. Think of the fluxes of the weather, the ever-changing skies, the turn of the tides, the run of the river, the movements of animals and the growth of plants. Immersed in these fluxes, it is the perceiver who must wait upon the world, attending to it in the sense of abiding with it and doing its bidding. And this is attention on the side of exposure. As the philosopher of education Jan Maschlein explains, exposure, from the Latin ex positio, literally means to be pulled ex out of position, positio, ex positio, pull out of position. So to be or to become attentive, for Maschlein, is to expose oneself, to be pulled out of position. Nothing to do with taking one's trousers down. I mean, this is a philosophy, not anyway. So it's being pulled out of position. So in this condition, one can no longer take anything for granted. The sense of understanding, of having solid ground beneath one's feet, is shaken, leaving one vulnerable and hyper-alert, wide-eyed in astonishment rather than narrowly focused on a target. And for Maschlein, it is precisely in these moments of exposure that education occurs. It's not so much an understanding as an undergoing that at once strips away the veneer of certainty with which we find comfort and security and opens to pure possibility. And this is just what happens as we gaze at the moon. And as far as my gaze knows the moon's light, observes the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty in his magisterial Phenomenology of Perception, dating from 1945, it is as a certain way of linking up with the phenomenon and communicating with it. It is a kind of symbiosis, he says, in which we give ourselves over to the light that invades us and saturates our awareness. So we find ourselves looking at the moon with moonstruck eyes. And with those eyes in the moonlight, the world itself takes on a different sheen. Now, if there are two sides to attention, of exposure and attunement, that is, of waiting on the world and tuning into a world in waiting, then what is the relation between the two? Surely to embark on any activity means placing one's existence on the line. The safe course would be to stay put. No one can live like that, however. To live, we have to get moving, to push the boat out into the current of a world in formation. And so all undergoing begins in exposure. But as it proceeds, skills of perception and action, born of practice and experience, begin to kick in. Now, let me take as an example one of the most ubiquitous of all human activities, namely walking on 2 feet. Every step entails a moment of jeopardy. Falling forwards on 1 foot, you tumble into the void only to regain your balance as the other foot comes to land on the ground ahead. So when I walk, I fall forward, and then luckily that foot came down in time. If it didn't, I would tumble right over. So that just taking that step is a moment of risk. Oops, and then down it goes. The skill of footwork comes in, and I'm all right again, and I can take the next step after that. So here the bodily skill of footwork comes to the rescue just before it is too late. So what begins in the vulnerability of exposure, if I put that foot forward, ends in the mastery of attunement, providing in turn the ground from which the walker can once again submit to the hazard of exposure in an alternation that continues for as long as the walk goes on. And this alternation, I believe, is fundamental to all life. And crucially, just as life is a one possibility thing, it is also unidirectional. That is, in real life, submission leads and mastery follows, never the reverse. Where submission casts off into a world in becoming, setting us loose to fall, mastery restores our grip so that we can keep on going. So the first is a movement of aspiration, the second, a moment of prehension. So an aspirant anticipation out in front feels its way forward, improvising a passage through an as yet unformed world, while bringing up the rear is a prehensile perception, already accustomed to the ways of the world and skilled in observing and responding to its affordances. And as submission gives way to mastery, aspiration to prehension, anticipation to perception, and exposure to attunement, there is what we could call a moment of inflection. So I'll draw this, describe the structure of attention like this. So this is the structure. We can draw it like a graph like this. So this whole thing is attention. It begins on this side with exposure. It ends on this side with attunement. This is the mastered skill of perception. This is the existential risk. And in between, moment of inflection. I take this sense of inflection from the writings of the philosopher Erin Manning. For her, inflection is not a movement in itself, but a variation in the way movement moves, coming at the point where a tentative opening matures from within what Manning calls the cleave of the event into a firm sense of direction. So you open up, you're not sure, and then there it goes. So you start from this moment of great possibility, of exposure, of risk, and as the movement moves forward, it from the inside, it takes on a firm sense of direction, and then the skill part kicks in. So inflection marks the turn from undergoing into doing, at which the line of possibility discloses distinct and realizable possibilities. And of course, the telescope is poised on that point, and the art of moon watching is to keep it precisely there. Now, I've introduced a couple of terms, aspiration and anticipation, which call for a little bit more elaboration. Literally, to aspire is to draw breath. It's an active, animated taking in. And to take in, as Dewey observes, I quote, we must summon energy and pitch it in a responsive key. With this summoning and pitching, aspiration calls upon the past in order to cast it forward into the future along a path of attention. Brimming with as yet undirected potential, with possibility, aspiration anticipates the future but does not predict it. Prediction, as we've seen, belongs to the logic of certainty and uncertainty. And depending on the level of certainty, things may be predicted with greater or lesser confidence or judged to be more or less probable. But anticipation belongs to the register of possibility. It is the temporal overshoot of a life that always wants to run ahead of itself. According to the philosopher Jacques Derrida, to anticipate is, I quote, to take the initiative, to be out in front, or to take, that is capere, in advance, ante capere, anticipation, take in advance. So far from predetermining the final forms of things or fixing their ultimate destinations, anticipation opens the path and improvises a passage. It is, if you will, a seeing into the future, not the projection of a future state in the present. It's to look where you're going, not to fix an endpoint. All life then is held in the tension between, I've written them up here because there are a lot of words, the tension between submission and mastery, aspiration and prehension, anticipation and perception, exposure and attunement. Effectively, these oppositions all map on to one another. In every case, then the first leads, submission, aspiration, anticipation, exposure leads, and the second follows. So mastery, prehension, perception, attunement all follow. So what leads is an aspiration that wells up in attention, and what follows is a precisely directed and skillfully executed maneuver. Moreover, as a one possibility thing, this life begins nowhere and ends nowhere, but carries on for all time, or for an every when that in Australian Aboriginal cosmology is identified with the dreaming. And yet we know that every mortal being will certainly die. So how can the infinitude of life be reconciled with the finitude of individual life cycles? And I think to answer this question, we have to think again about generations, because there's a deeply held belief in many minds today that life is lived within generations, but does not flow between them. What passes between generations, often described as a heritage or inheritance, is a legacy of information and resources which provides the capital from which successor generations can build lives in their turn. The information may be genetic or cultural, the resources material or ideational. Their sole common denominator is that they are available for transmission independently of their lifetime expression or achievement. It's easy to see in this view a reflection of the idea that life is lived in the fulfillment of potential. And this leads, as I've observed already, to a dead end. With all potential exhausted, there is no life to be continued in coming generations. Only the discards left along the way remain to be passed on. Each generation occupying its own slice of time seems fated to replace its predecessor and to be replaced in its turn, like layers in a stack. So we think of generations like this. And then the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one. This is our generation, this is the last one, the one before that. And there's relations of inheritance between the two. These are the different layers. Indeed, this kind of stratigraphical thinking is deeply seared into modern sensibilities, leading to an easy equation of generational layers, with layers of sedimentation in the history of the earth, of deposits in the occupation of an archaeological site, of documents in an archive, and even of consciousness in the human mind. It's a way of thinking that feeds directly into a rhetoric of extinction that wonders whether the coming generation or any after that might be the last, be it for our own or any other species. And it's the reason why we feel ourselves facing a future blighted by uncertainty. So to lift the curse of uncertainty and to restore a sense of possibility, we need to imagine generations differently. And the way to imagine them, I think, is instead of a stack like that, to imagine them like a braid, something like that. We've seen that as a one possibility thing, life is lived not transversally, but longitudinally. So let's compare every particular life to one strand of an intergenerational braid. The strand is only so long, but the braid can continue indefinitely because even as old strands give out, new ones are paid in. Or you could do it instead of a braid, you could think of a rope. You make a rope out of fibers. Every fiber is so long that the rope can just go on winding, because when as fast as strands fibers give out, you're paying new ones in. Nothing here is inherited, nor does a break in the chain of transmission herald extinction. Rather, it's in the overlap of generations that the life process is carried on. As Bergson, my philosophical hero, put it so vividly, just as the individual feels the swell of the past leaning over the present that is about to join it, so with life in general, we see each generation leaning over the generation that shall follow. And this leaning over is a gesture of care, even of love. And herein for Bergson lies the true mystery of life, to which we should add its true possibility. How much are our fears of the end of history, of biodiversity loss and final extinction, a function of the way we have sliced up the generations, setting them over and against one another, denying both the productivity of their collaboration and the affectivity of their care? I think we need to bring them together again. And of course, that's precisely what happened, albeit momentarily, when I, as a child walking home from school, encountered the aged, bearded moonwatcher. My walk through the familiar terrain of woods and fields unexpectedly fell into line with an observation which coupled the myopia of the peering eye with the intimate immensity of the cosmos. And at that very moment, my initial fright gave way to an unforgettable astonishment. But astonishment is not the same as surprise. And the distinction parallels one I've already drawn between anticipation and prediction. And if the other side of prediction is the failure of ignorance, the other side of anticipation is the possibility of not knowing. I want to show that not knowing and ignorance are entirely different. The idea of ignorance rests on the presumption that to come into knowledge, things have to be explained to us. And the idea of prediction rests on the presumption that things are explicable. So ignorance and prediction are two sides of the same coin, and both are key to the rhetoric of normal science. According to the model of conjecture and refutation, which science owes to the philosophy of Karl Popper, progress in any field of inquiry lies in its cumulative record of predictive failures, which has lifted us from the state of ignorance to one of knowledgeable enlightenment. But for science, the way to know the world is not to open oneself to it, as you would perhaps to another person, but just the contrary, to hold it at a distance. And this is done by means of methodology, by which is meant a set of protocols expressly devised to immunize the investigator from any infection arising from too close a contact with the phenomena of his or her investigation. The aim then is to grasp these phenomena within a grid of concepts and categories. So scientists are surprised, but not astonished, when their predictions turn out to be wrong. But prediction rests on the conceit that the world can be held to account. So scientists depend on the unexpected to know that events are taking place and that history is being made. By contrast, those who are open and attentive to the world, among the many so-called indigenous peoples, but also most children, whose minds are yet to be subjected to adult disciplinary oppression, though perpetually astonished, are never surprised, because they're not so arrogant as to believe that the world is predictable, even in principle, or that it can be held to account. Their openness or exposure renders them vulnerable, but it is also a source of strength, resilience, and wisdom, and it allows for ongoing responsiveness. Why, after all, should we gaze at the moon when we know so much about it already? Isn't it because it is really so astonishing? And an astonished attention is one that goes along with and answers to the movements of things. It allows us to correspond with them. And I mean correspondence here, not in the logico-mathematical sense of matching one set of elements with another by some principle of homology that leads any one element in the first set to equate with one or more elements in the second and vice versa. I mean, rather, to invoke the process by which beings or things literally answer to one another over time. For example, in the exchange of letters or words in conversation, or of gifts, or even of holding hands. Correspondence, in this sense, is about joining with rather than joining up. Joining up is connection, as in an optical diagram that connects the eye to the moon. But to observe the moon is to correspond with it. The moon questions the watcher, arouses his curiosity, and he is moved to respond. And this response is not just a reaction, as if to a disturbance of vision that erupts into consciousness, but an answering that prolongs the watcher's own tendency, which lies in a desire not to know more about the moon, but to become better acquainted with it. And I want to draw a clear contrast here between correspondence and interaction. Interaction goes back and forth as agents face each other off, as for example, in an interview situation. But correspondence, in my terms, is not face-to-face, but side by side. It's a matter of going along together. So this is interaction. Correspondence, A is going along this way, B is going along that, and they're answering to one another as we go. So where integration is transverse, correspondence is longitudinal. The first is bounded by ends, set apart by each party. And the prosecution, so these ends are commonly known as interests, from the Latin intra, between, and esse, to be. So the prosecution of interests in interaction is like an oscillation between 2 points. But correspondence is not a connection of points, but a binding of lines. It's not interactive, but multilinear. And these lines join not at the ends, but in the middle. The ends are not given in advance, but emerge in the action itself and are recognizable as such only in the acknowledgement of new beginnings. So here, beginnings produce endings and are produced by them, and every end is not a terminal, but a moment along the way. So in interaction, participants are positioned alternately as agents and patients. One does, the other is done to, and the tables are turned, such as what the latter does is now done to the former. And that continues through a series of reversals that goes on for as long as the interaction endures. The correspondence is neither active nor passive, but takes place in what linguists call the middle voice of the verb. In the middle voice, whatever you do is also achieved in you. Or to return to an earlier distinction, every doing is an undergoing. Just to return to the example of walking, I might, of course, intend to go for a walk, but once on my way, I am my walking, and my walking walks me. I carry on and am carried. I do it, but I'm equally transformed by it. And so it is too with the man in the moon, because it's the moon's light that illuminates his seeing and bears the weight of his observations. Walking and looking are both instances of doing and undergoing, neither active nor passive, but in the middle voice. And it's precisely in this regard, in its conduct in the middle voice, that correspondence differs from interaction. Now, it doesn't mean that we can arrive at correspondence simply by an inversion that turns the back and forth of interaction outside in, as in the idea of intra-action, an idea originally proposed by the philosopher of science Karen Barad, but which many social and cultural theorists have subsequently taken to heart. We arrive at it rather by turning from the transverse to the longitudinal. So correspondence is not just a falling forward, it's a feeling forward, an improvisation that is continually responsive to the movements of others. And it's a responsiveness that goes along. As such, as the philosophical anthropologist Thomas Swartz-Wenzer, responsiveness precedes responsibility. It is the existential condition to the answer that I am. So if we do things responsibly, it is because they fall to us to do them. And they are in that sense in the nature of tasks. And in correspondence, everything we do is a task. But no task is without risk. The risk of falling for the things that fall to you. Safety and security lie in understanding, in having a firm base, a ground of certain knowledge from which to do what you will. And from the stance of understanding, the improvisational feeling forward of correspondence seems laced with uncertainty, unpredictability, and frustration. And yet it nevertheless opens to possibility, anticipation, and hope. So the choice here is between understanding and undercommoning. If to understand means finding support in a shared foundation, undercommoning is just the opposite. It's not a reversion to a baseline of what we all have in common to begin with, but rather a way of living together in possibility. It means joining with other souls in the adventure of undergoing. You could perhaps liken it to the experience you have when walking in the hills and suddenly finding that you are lost. All at once, the ground no longer feels so certain beneath your feet. And yet at the same time, you become hyper attentive to everything around you that might possibly offer clues to your whereabouts. Erin Manning, who I mentioned earlier, compares this to the experience of autistic people. For most of us, most of the time, things fall quickly into place so that after only a moment's hesitation or uncertainty, which passes so quickly that we don't even notice, we know what they are and how to deal with them. Rarely do we linger in uncertainty, instead passing quickly and imperceptibly into categorization. So from the astonishment of I can see, we slide immediately into the unsurprising normalcy of I see this or that. But for autistic people, Manning suggests, this moment may be prolonged even indefinitely. So like walkers who are lost, they linger in the fullness of attention in which things are as yet unformed. And this is to see things in their incipience, ever on the point of revealing themselves for what they are. So it's a question not so much of being uncertain of what things are, as of opening to the possibility of what they might be. And perhaps it's the same with artists. They are never surprised, but perpetually astonished. And for this very reason, we have much to learn from them and from their art. And yet, this stretch of attention, as we've seen, is fraught with risk. Reaching out from what is already to hand, it forsakes the security of our present position for an unknown future. And surely that's what thinking is, a reaching out beyond the realm of what is already explicable or even conceivable. It lies in the hesitant overflowings that pull us out of certain knowledge. Thinking in this sense always unsettles thought. It lies in the excess of imagination over conceptualization. And in just the same way, to gaze through the eyepiece of a telescope is not to take a snapshot, but to linger in the realm of astonishment. This is the realm of hopes and dreams, in which experience, as yet unformed, has still to surrender the partition and categorization. Only when we lower the glass do we say, oh, so that was the moon, but by then the dream has already faded. So allow me to conclude with one final distinction. That would be an awful lot, but here's one more. There are real problems and fake problems. Fake problems include the jigsaw puzzle, the Rubik's Cube, the crossword, and the maze. These problems already contain their solutions inside them. But real problems have no solutions. Rather, one problem leads to another. So the path is a real problem, so also is life. Likewise, there is real freedom and fake freedom. Just as fake problems contain their solutions, so fake freedom contains its objectives. Fake freedom, offering the choice of multiple possibilities, is opposed to the necessity of mechanical predetermination. But real freedom lies in the singular possibility of the path. And this is the freedom that does not already impose a destination or target or a prefigured outcome. It's instead a freedom that undestines things, that opens up to new beginnings, that overtakes any objectives that might be thrown in its way. And this is the freedom to correspond, to go along with others. And it's not opposed to necessity, to determination. On the contrary, freedom and necessity are one and the same. But the necessity of freedom in this sense lies not in predetermination, but in an attention to things and the ways they want to go. It's the necessity, in short, of constraint, which literally means binding together, such that each along its own way participates in the fortunes of the others. So it's not about joining up, it's about joining with. Now, in contemporary liberal societies, the institutions of education, science, and the state promise us freedom, but it's a freedom boxed in necessity. It arms us with certain knowledge and offers immunity so that we can remain safe and secure, protected from the existential risk of exposure. But the predictive certainty these institutions offer is as illusory as is fake freedom, because the very idea that predictive knowledge demands explication also perpetuates the equation of not knowing with ignorance. Education, science, and the state are all powerful machines for the production of ignorance. Children, folk, or lay persons, indigenous people, all are made to feel ignorant as a prelude and an excuse for their education. And a measure of educational success lies in the reproduction of ignorance in the next generation, and so it goes on. But it need not be like this. For the world we live in is rich with the possibility of growth and transformation. In this world of life, of souls rather than selves, not knowing is not a form of ignorance, but a form of wisdom. The wisdom that lies in turning towards the world rather than turning our backs on it, in opening to replenishment beyond fulfillment, undergoing beyond doing, astonishment beyond surprise, undercommoning beyond understanding, truth beyond the facts. It lies, in short, in paying attention to things. After all, the moon is still shining in the heavens. Doesn't it make more sense to welcome it into our lives and to walk in its company than to contrive to plant our feet upon the moon itself, only to leave our prints in the dust? Bereft of knowledge before the heavens of my life, wrote the poet Rainer Maria Rilke, I stand astonished. I will yearn for no closer connections. So was it Rilke's double whom I met on my way home from school that day? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have now the opportunity for raising questions, issues. Are there? Okay, indeed, please.
And it was so lovely to be with you with the drawing as well as the listening. I thought a lot when you were speaking about, I suppose, traditions of the amateur and the idea of the amateur as one who, in studying something, loves it and is transformed back or affected back. And I also thought about, so that caring, being transformed back by something as a kind of mode of care, and also the sense of what the amateur might care for is also caring for something not just for me individually, but as it might be taken up by another. And I guess I was thinking about that in that sense of your kind of return to questions of intergenerationality. So I guess I wondered, and I mean, I thought of people like, Barber, with his insects, and Jacob von Uexküll with his foray, Rachel Carson, and these forms of science that are not divorced from that kind of relation, which you could think of in terms of the exposure and attunement, perhaps. And so, yeah, I wondered if you might talk about that and talk about it perhaps in an intergenerational sense, but also perhaps it struck me because there's the moon and there's the telescope. So there's the relation with the moon, but there's also the technologies and the techniques and the caring for in a way that affects back and allows for the inheritance of modes of attention that are then shared. So, I mean, these were the thoughts I had in my head when I was listening.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. I mean, first of all, yes, I think we should all become amateurs in some sense. Maybe this is idealistic because we also, as scholars, for example, have to live and get an income somehow. But nevertheless, I think the difference between the professional, this distinction between the professional and the amateur, it has a long history. It would take too long to go into the history of it all, but there's been a certain, in the last few decades, I think, there's been a certain kind of professionalization throughout academia, linked to the CV, the publication record, and the rest of it, in which the purpose of study is to stage a career, and that then is very clearly opposed to studying for the love of it. And most of us who are caught up in the academic world find ourselves very conflicted. I mean, we study what we study for the love of it, but we also have to earn a living, and that puts us under the constraints of the professional mode, and we end up having to juggle between the two. And most of us find this extremely stressful. I certainly, and I'm retired, so I can enjoy a luxury life, but I think we all experience this tension, and I wish it would. I wish it was so that in the university of the future, whatever it is, we could have an institutional setup in which study for the love of it is considered to be something that contributes to the common good, and is therefore something which society itself feels worthy of investing in. That would be my kind of utopia. We're very far from that at the moment. So I'm all for amateur study. Amateur in the good sense, not of doing things in a slapdash way without being practiced, but amateur in the good sense of studying something for its intrinsic worth, for the love of studying it. And then the second point you made, very, very important, is not just for yourself. That we study, we love what we study. We feel sometimes a calling, a vocation to study particular things, whatever it might be, because you feel too that just as a composer of music wants to compose great music so that other people will hear it, you want to study things so others will enjoy, benefit from the knowledge or the wisdom too that you are able to contribute. And the intergenerational thing, I think, is really, really critical. I sometimes, this is another project that I'm trying to write a sort of long essay at the moment about how we imagine relations between generations. And I think the way we have sliced the generations up, putting like the young here and the old over here, it's relatively recent historically, and I think it's a tragedy. And that if one could just put old and young together, kids and older people, juniors and seniors, imagine a routine that they would normally be working together, collaborating, and that out of that collaboration, they're continually making a future. That also would be my dream of what amateur study should be like, which is the reason I took this particular incident of me, a school kid about 8 or 9, and this old man. I thought that's where it ought to be happening. But at the moment, both kids and old people are excluded. Kids are supposed to just at school, they're supposed to be learning stuff. Old people have had it, they're past it. So that's the other thing. Then the additional thing you mentioned is about technology, and you rightly observed that the telescope was a device that has a particular history again, and that history wouldn't have happened had it not been for developments in optics and at the time, and in metallurgy and in glassmaking. And that's all true, but we don't have to be against instrumentation or against equipment. What we should be against, I think, is the idea that what the role of that equipment is to set up a barrier between ourselves and what we observe in such a way that what we observe should not in any way influence our observation of it. Again, I don't think that's the protocol in science. It's not the reality. We talk to any practicing scientist, and they will be the first to admit that their observational powers are educated by the very things, plants, animals, astronomical phenomena that they're investigating, which is why just not anybody can come along and substitute for them, because it's a skill that develops through long experience. But they're not allowed to give proper recognition for this in the way science is reported and written up. And I think that's the problem.
I'm going to go with 2 more questions from the room, and then I'm going to read out some. So, as promised, there is an excess of questions as part of the excess of life, I guess. Please.
So thank you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it, and I especially felt that your usage of metaphors was very apt and definitely helped in me developing an understanding of what's going on. I apologize if my question is something you've touched on in your other writings. I'm not familiar, so sorry if I'm just making you repeat yourself. But you talk at one point about imagining generations differently to overcome this issue of uncertainty and certainty and how it's pressing down upon us. And I was just wondering if this issue, this tension is mitigated if one believes in the possibility of reincarnation, because it feels like that deals with a lot of the issues of the notion of self and the issue of the world, a life of becoming rather than being, and you getting rid of and reincarnation weakening the ideas of identity being so important and prevalent. It feels like that mitigates a lot of the tension in what you were discussing and needing to be resolved in imagining a generation in another way.
Yes, it does. I mean, the answer I think is yes, but you don't even have to articulate it in that specific form. So let me just put something to you which I've been puzzling about a lot as you question. Because another metaphor I've used recently is to suppose that imagine a whole lot of people lined up in a queue. There's their view, so that they're queuing for the cinema or something, and these are the ones who came earliest. So they were before. Oh, it's you. Suppose this is you, and then they're the people who came after. Now imagine generations like this. Imagine that generations are all in this one long queue. Then the people who came before, they're your ancestors. So the ancestors actually are the future for you. That's where you're heading. And where your children, they're the past. But yet we keep saying, oh, no, the ancestors are in the past, our kids are the future. How do we get that? I think because here, what happens in modernity. We turn around on the present and say, okay, I'm going to face this way. I'm going to turn my back on that. And immediately, you are face to face with your kids, whilst your ancestors are disappearing somewhere off into the background. So that the future, what was the future becomes the past, and what was the past becomes the future. And so something odd has been going on there. That for a lot of these people, many people around the world, many indigenous people who would say, we follow tradition. And we come along and say, oh, that means you're stuck in the past. You're the ancestors, they were back then. And they say, no. The ancestors are our future. They hold the promise of the future, and we're following them. And they may then say that, well, actually, our kids are then coming around again, or they may not. But the key point is that the dead are actually they've already gone where we're heading, and in that sense they represent the possibility of the future. And here's one little example that I read recently in The Guardian. It was a very fine article about Fiji, where in Fiji, because of climate change and rising sea levels, they're having to move coastal villages inland. And the article is about the particular logistical and other problems they have in moving communities. And what was so fascinating was they said that the biggest problem of all is what to do about the ancestors. because the bare bones of the ancestors are buried there in the communities right there next to the sea. And people say, oh, well, never mind, there's ancestors there, finished, you can move up there. But people say, you can't do that. You can't either just let your ancestors get washed out to sea, nor can you kind of dig them up and move them somewhere else, because the ancestors are their future. And if you abandon the ancestors, it's not just that you're not just being cut off from a nostalgic past, you're actually cutting yourself off from the future. And that seems to be, it's somehow so very, very important that we've lost that way of thinking.
Dominic? Thanks so much for the talk. Great to see so many people in the audience. I just wondered, so the anecdote that you began with, I wondered if you could clarify a detail for me. So as you described it, you walked, you spotted, and then you talked. And so I got it right that you didn't walk and talk.
No.
And I'm wondering, had you have walked and talked, would a different arc of possibility arise? And my question coming out from that is the university future a peripatetic one?
It could be, and certainly it should have much more walking around than before. And yes, I mean, it's true as far as the detail is concerned. I stopped. He was the old man was in a sort of kneeling position on the ground. Let's go up there. So I stopped and spoke to him, but he didn't move from that position. But my colleagues and I in Aberdeen have done some research on ordinary walking in urban as well as rural environments, and one of the things we immediately learned from this. People said that the most sociable thing you can do, the most friendly kind of thing you can do, is to be walking down the street side by side with a companion. Much more sociable than the classic model of face-to-face communication. Actually, face-to-face is pretty difficult because you each sees what's behind the other person's back. You're eye to eye, it's very aggressive, it's potentially violent, it's difficult. But walking side by side, you've got the same view ahead. Neither of you can see what's behind. And when they're walking together, people are not looking at one another. They might just tilt your head a little bit in conversation, but they're actually coordinating their movement through peripheral vision rather than focal vision, and continually responding the gait, the step to the other person's movement so that you more or less keep in synchrony. And so that's felt to be a very sociable thing. Imagine then you follow two companions and they're walking along, and then suddenly they get into an argument or a row, and they turn around and face one another, and then they neither can move any further without bumping into the other. So that what's really nice about that kind of peripatetic correspondence, as I'd call it, is precisely that a conversation can go on without collision. It's more like a relay, or which is sort of turn-taking, as in a conversation, or as in playing a string quartet or something like that. It carries on through time. And I think that has immense educational possibility, yes, and that we could maybe try and design our educational spaces in a way that allows for that possibility.
Can I just make one very brief remark, which is I wish MS Teams was based on that. So thank you.
So one question from the chat. Ewan Jenkins asks, writes, Gustav Landauer wrote that we are each as individuals, and then this is a citation, the instance of the eternal community of ancestors. Would you agree with this sentiment? Well, and what does this do to our sense of ourselves as either individuals or subjects? articles.
Wow. I mean, I think sort of basically I agree with that, with the point that we are, it's just that this immense community of ancestors, if you start trying to tick them all off, becomes unmanageable. So that it's something more like there's a point at which, in which the individuality merges. That one image, again, that I find helpful, it also comes from Bergson, is that every individual life is like an eddy in the stream. The water's going along, it deviates a little bit, turns on itself, and will keep on turning as long as it has the strength to do so. And eventually, that energy will dissipate, and that water will run back into the stream again. At that point, it ceases to be recognizable as any particular person, but it becomes part of the stream. So, and the beauty of that is actually when you die, you melt back into life. And there are people who, speaking as wearing my anthropological hat, and there are people who hold that view that it's if you like a kind of transition from the actual to the possible. That as long as you're alive, you're in some sort of sense holding up the life process, but you can't hold it up because it's so powerful. You can't hold it up for all that long, and eventually you merge back into it again. So in that sense, yes, we are all part of the community of ancestors, but rather than thinking of it as a community, I think of it perhaps as I don't know exactly how I think of it, but some sort of great, Watson talked about the great blast of life. I think he was writing at a time when hot air ballooning was just all the rage in France, but I like that. I like that kind of image of it. Yeah.
Hi. Always a fantastic talk, Tim. I found it really interesting when you were talking about trying to de-concrete the future, and like that we have too much of a focus on knowledge of specific events. And I couldn't help but think of the philosopher Jean-Pierre Dupuy, who takes quite the opposite approach of saying that in order to properly respond to the future, instead of thinking of ourselves as having infinite possibilities, thinking of very concrete, absolute things in the future. I was wondering if you had interacted with him at all, or if you think that your views and his could work together.
I'm afraid I haven't, but it sounds from what you say in your précis that we would find it quite difficult
Yes, yeah.
to come to
exactly the opposite.
I think that does sound like exactly the opposite. And I find myself reacting against people who want somehow who claim to have any authority actually to state what the conditions of the future might be. It seems to be somewhat arrogant. Certainly have problems with the artificial intelligence crowd, you know, who tell us, you know, that full artificial intelligence, the kind of disembodied post-humanism in which we'll all be virtual intelligences wandering around in the planet. And they say, you know, this is the way things are going. You stop being ostrich in the head in the sand. You know, this is the way things are going. You better just get used to it. I get really angry because I think, you know, these people have absolutely no right to claim that this is the way things are going. And if they're going in ways that seem to be wrong, or at least not to be conducive to the continuity of life, then we should stand up and object instead of just saying, "Oh, that's the way things are going." So I applaud the concreteness in the sense that we have to come down from the tower, and there are concrete problems in the world, and they have to be addressed. And we can't, and they won't be addressed by philosophical arm waving. But I don't think that I would. I think he's on the side of prediction rather than anticipation.
It's mainly, I think, with in relation to climate change that he's projecting forwards, like the climate crisis.
Yes, which people are doing, but I think part of our problem in dealing with the climate crisis is that it is framed within a language of scientific modeling and prediction, which does not accord actually with the experience of people on the ground who are having to deal with it. And I think that maybe a different framing would both be more humane and also give us a bit more hope. I think that's what it is.
I'm involved at the art school here, and the whole concept of not knowing is really key to how people engage with material and idea and thought. And the phrase that you used during this, that I thought was really rather beautiful, the idea that things fall to us as tasks. And one thing that fell to you as a task was to be involved in a manifesto campaign at your university. And, you know, they kind of like to make the university, you know, into an ethical place in some ways. And how much of that succeeded? And what advice would you give it to any other institution? This was a key issue.
I thought forever about this, but well, I mean, the story from my angle is that we succeeded. I mean, what happened was we for anybody who doesn't know, I mean, we were going through a bad patch in the University of Aberdeen up the road, and we had a new principal from about 2010, and management of bean counting, cutting, demoralizing, measuring everything, performance management culture was awful, and people were leaving, they were getting upset, morale was rock bottom, and it was around during the summer of 2015, colleagues from different departments kept coming to me saying, Tim, what are you going to do about this? And I think they sort of assumed that I had to do something. It fell to me, the task, I think because people thought I was bulletproof, you know, that they could sack, and they were sacking all sorts of other people, but if they sacked me, they'd have a scandal. Therefore, anyway, we did a lot of campaign. Well, we set up a movement reclaiming our university and seminars, and from those we developed a manifesto, which we published, and the long and short of it was that by 2017, 2 years later, the principal and the senior management were all out of a job. We got into them. Now, there is another alternative story, which is that they left because of financial irregularities and problems with the money men. But our argument is that no, actually, they were booted out by our campaign. So the campaign was actually successful. And after that, it dissolved because there was nothing left to do. We had a new principal who is formally committed to the principles set out in the manifesto. So the answer is that it can be done. But it requires a sort of, it has to have somebody leading it or some group leading it who are powerful enough to do so without being kicked out. And even I found it extremely stressful at times. I mean, I was really anxious. But the other thing is that we all know what the problem with the neoliberal university is. Umpteen books have been written about it. We can moan on and on about the capitalism and blah, blah, blah. But the key problem is, or the task for us, is to come up with a coherent vision of what the university of the future should be. There's no good complaining. We have to say, here's an alternative, and this is how it would be run and how it would be managed. So that's what we were trying to do with the manifesto. We were trying to say all the time that this is not a protest movement. It's an attempt to set up a model of what our university could be, built on those four principles of freedom, trust, education, and community. I still believe in that, and it also seemed to me that if we can do it anywhere, we can do it in Scotland, because Scotland has a very fine educational tradition, and Scotland's politicians are actually open to ideas and want to hear from us as to what they know, that there are problems with the university. They want to hear from us to how things should be done differently. That's not the case in England. You know? So it's not altogether hopeless.
I have to say, because this is a public forum, I'm speaking entirely hypothetical about an imaginary university.
Okay, one more question from the chat. Catherine Everett raises the question. You point to a lot of interesting dichotomies, wisdom and knowledge, the self and the soul, and also provided the point, the quote that I am a vortex. You also said that life is pure access. So is it fair that what you call wisdom is somewhat like an access to rationality?
I should think so. And it's certainly that, I mean, that sort of figure behind all this that I didn't mention, or the philosophy behind all this, is Whitehead's process ontology. And Whitehead introduced this very difficult to understand, quite coming back now into very influential. Whitehead introduced this term concrescence, and crescent means it's the becoming equivalent of creation. Creation means already done. Crescent means like with the crescent moon, undergoing creation, not finished. And con, of course, means with, together. So concrescence means like undergoing creation together. And Whitehead wanted to see kind of basically the whole world. That was his ontology. It's a world in which everything is continually undergoing creation together in its relations with other things. And we're part of that field of ongoing creation. And in that sense, he would say that, I think he got it from me, life is continually overtaking itself. What it creates is itself a bit further on. Its existence is continually becoming. So that's kind of behind it. And hopefully that answers the question.
Absolutely egoistically, I put myself on the list and then give the word to you. Because I was wondering, so I think it's Kafka who wrote that walking is horizontal falling. Right? And that sort of means one can say that if there's a change of the dimensionality, like almost like a quarter turn, and you seem to have performed that kind of quarter turn all along. I mean, the different perspective on the generational relations. And I was wondering, that also seems to be a strange kind of turn that is going on here, right? Where does that come from? I mean, right, yeah. I mean, is there in the excess of life a movement of life against itself?
What there is, and this has been really doing my head in. I started thinking of before and after, future, past, trying to get these sorted out. I was really sort of getting screwed up, and then until I came up with this metaphor of the queue, and I thought, oh, that helps. It sorted some things out for me. But even then, I got myself in a twist because I was thinking about two words in particular. One was aging, and the other was begetting. When in the Bible, when they talk about Adam beget, the long genealogies, which each person begets the next, who begets the next, who begets the next. And you get that sense of a genealogical chain or line that follows through. But what was really doing my head in was that I realized that movement of begetting is in the opposite direction to the movement of aging. and yet they're both going along together and imply different senses of what was the past and the future. So if you imagine you're walking along a trail and you're leaving these footsteps, so that you're treating a trail of footsteps behind you, but you're moving in this direction. So the trail is going that way, but you're going that way. And I'm still in a bit of a state of confusion about it, as I think everybody else is. But then when I come up with a metaphor, the first thing I go to the dictionary and see, where did this word queue come from? And of course it comes from the Latin caius for tail. And what happens is you start with the tail, and then it became a plait, and then it became guys going on in the other direction. So it sort of worked.
Two more. Yeah. I was just wondering,
when you were talking about the division between soul and the self and knowledge and wisdom, that give me one moment. Whereas the soul's instinct is to some extent gives rise to its own discovery or manifestation, articulation, whatever word you pick. What could be said for the motivation behind knowledge?
Why do we even
So-
want knowledge?
Yeah, so where the soul has some sort of a nature to tend towards itself maybe, or to circumambulate itself by judging that drawing that you drew.
Yeah.
What is it that maybe justifies or gives rise to the pursuit of knowledge?
I think well, one answer might be that the self, with the construction of the self, there is an a priori separation of me in here and the world out there. So you set up a boundary of a kind, self-world boundary, which doesn't exist with the soul, but it does because the soul is just this vortex. So it's just like with the eddy in the river, right? You can't say the eddy is not bounded, it's the movement. But as soon as you set up the idea of a self in a body, then you've got the self as against the external world. And then you say, okay, I need knowledge in order to deal with this external world. I need knowledge of the external world, which in order partly to, in much of the literature, it's conceived in terms of attack and defense. So that the external world is not friendly. It's one that is likely to stand in opposition to you, and therefore you need the knowledge of what is out there in order to deal with it, either through defensive or attacking postures. Hence, your knowledge is power, and the rest of the stuff. And the conventional educational discourse today, where we're told that students need to have all the knowledge so that they can then go out into the world and thrive in what is projected as a highly competitive environment. That would, to my mind, be the motivation for knowledge, and the reason why in our system knowledge has been over-egged with wisdom. Like I said, I'm not suggesting that we just have lots of wisdom and forget about the knowledge side. That would be ridiculous. But I heard Biestos, the philosopher of education, talking about this, and he used the kind of image of a horse and a cart, and the trouble is that the cart has got so heavy that the horse is stuck up in the air, and we just need to get it so that both the cart and the horse are on the ground.
I think maybe that the city is growing ever more big and enclosed, that it sort of has pit us against nature in a similar way that the self might pit itself against the external world. And that I'm just thinking about analogies to, for example, climate change and the attitudes towards nature.
Certainly, there's a sense that, in fact, it's a funny kind of thing that in the last decade or two, people have suddenly come to a realization that there is no inevitability for humans to exist on the planet. That the rest of it, the planet's inhabitants, as well as everything else, couldn't really care less whether humans are here or not. And that's caused a great deal of existential angst at the moment. It was, and that is pretty recent. I mean, I was looking back for different reasons as to what I was thinking. I produced this book a year ago, and a reprint of a book that I published in 2000, and I had to write a new preface for that reprint. So I was thinking about what it felt like now compared with what it felt like around the turn of the millennium, and the sorts of issues that I felt were sort of crucial. And real sea change just in those last 20 years in my perception of things. In 2000, I was just dealing with my own actual existential problems. But I could still feel there's some sense that one could imagine being part of a world And today I had the feeling there's a conflict between two positions in my head that neither of which works. I mean, one position is to say that the whole world of nature is so disenchanted now that one could view it as casually as one might look at images on the internet or on television. And that's the kind of Attenborough thing. You see it all on TV, it's on the internet. Oh, well, you know. And the other view is nature is that there is an amazing, wondrous, extraordinary nature out there, but it doesn't care that there's no position in that nature for us. So we're faced with those two things, a sort of a casual turn of the world into a media product, and on the other hand, a world that has no care for us at all. And the main problem I have with a lot of contemporary post-humanist, so-called anti-anthropocentrism discourse is that it does not offer a place for humans to play a constructive part in the future in the world's flourishing. And I think it should, because we know from archaeology that in many parts of the world, human activities, like in the Amazon, human activities contributed massively to the flourishing of plant and animal life, the biodiversity, and so on. So it's not as though the human presence is automatically destructive, on the contrary. So I think we need to have a way of thinking that can show us that there is a way, actually a kind of anthropocentrism that says, yes, we are in the world, we're at the heart of it. And we have to be at the heart of it in order to care for it. And being at the heart of it and caring for it, we can actually do good for the world as a whole and contribute to flourishing. So that's
Professor Ingold. First of all, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. And is that I'm also researching, and like my PhD has gone very deep into the ancestors. And I was wondering, because the graph that you just made about the past and the present, and like the way we see the ancestors in the future, it's my understanding is a notion that exists already in the Andean cosmovision, and it is related with the perception of time, because in Occident, the perception of time is a linear thing. Well, for Andean cosmologies, time is circular, spiral thing, where you are in constant view of what has happened, but you can't see the future because it's behind. You go and you walk the line towards the future. And I was wondering, at the moment that when you encountered this way of thinking and this way of being, do you think there is any way in which this could be actually understood within spaces of academia, contemporary academia? I'm kind of approaching this idea of decolonial thinking, decolonializing the ways of we understand time. That is like a very strong structure. The ways of we understand the living beings and the non-living beings. In my research, I state that we cohabit with the ancestors because there are traces that we can have, physical traces, physical presence. That's my question.
Yeah, no, it's a big question, and I can see exactly where you're coming from, and it is part of the colonial language that we've inherited, that academia has inherited, to say or sort of assume that people who claim to be following tradition or people who claim to be following their ancestors are therefore living in the past, and a past which has been overtaken by the present. And that is, I think, as you said, a fundamental misunderstanding based on a certain notion of time. But question, I don't know. I mean, we were all sorts of efforts are going on to decolonize the academy at the moment. They're much more prominent in fields of humanities and social science, or maybe philosophy, but the hard sciences have scarcely even noticed. So it's a long way still to go with them. But I take heart from the thought that there are parts of the European philosophical tradition which are not completely stuck with the colonial model and do resonate quite closely with Andean or even other European or Western cosmologies. So, for example, I was reading about, because I'm interested in northern circumpolar peoples, so I'm in fact examining a brilliant thesis on the Chukchi people who inhabit the northeast of Siberia, and about their ideas of life and death and so on. And it's very subtle because they have two words that could translate as life or existence or something like that. And one of them is for the actual living being like you and me, and the other is for existence itself. And when you die, you move from the actual to the possible, the actual to the virtual. And of course, having read Bergson, I thought, well, that's all there. And I said that and then you don't want to sort of make facile comparisons and say, well, actually the Chukchi are thinking just like Bergson. But all the same, there are these resonances which, and academic fashions come and go. Bergson, who's always been my philosophical hero, when I first read him, was deeply out of fashion when he's now back in fashion again. And so that, I think there's hope. And that's why I come back to anthropology. That there can be a decolonial anthropology, which is actually a study of the philosophical, inquiry into these philosophical questions about the conditions and possibilities of human life, but one that debates these questions and brings into the conversation people everywhere and the wisdom of people everywhere, instead of saying, well, we've got it. So I think it can be done. It's a long haul.
Okay, that's 3 more questions, 2 from the room, 1 online. Tina, please.
Thank you. I will try to hurry up. I'll do my best, but this question really leads me nicely to my question. So I work a lot on Bergson and Whitehead, and I was just wondering, what would you think about this idea? The problem here is that we're still imagining a line. There's a past, there's a future, and somewhere on the line I'm dropped in. But that's not actually how we live life. Right? So if you think in terms of duration, or if you think in terms of epochal time, like Whitehead, we create time in our lives. Who we are right now is connected to the past because we are resolved from the past, and who we are now is throwing us towards the future. And wherever I turn, I can put some point and fix it as my future or my past. So it doesn't matter which directionality I choose. I have them all open to me. But that only happens if I don't imagine time as a line with one dimension here and another dimension there, whichever one I put, it doesn't matter. And like I insert the self.
Okay, I wish you could have filmed you as you're doing this, because you're doing the most amazing gestures.
I always talk with my hands. I grew up in Italy.
And there you go. But the point is, you are making lines. That's that. And so what you called the line was actually a particular kind of line, which you often diagrammatically, it's usually shown to be straight. It doesn't have to be, and often linking A, B, C, D along it. I've written 2 books about lines, and the whole point about them was that that is a line. And in fact,
but if you twist it through time, does it really? It has another dimension. It's more than just a line. It also has a dimension. It's 4-dimensional.
Well, you can say that because it's 4-dimensional, because as I drew that, it took me some time to draw it. So it was something that had an ontogeny. It was part of my life for just a very short moment. So what I'm trying to show is that the linearity is there, but it's not the kind of line, it's what you might call a non-linear linearity. But the lines are still there as long as you're moving and tracing and making gestures, there are lines. So I go back, of course, to Paul Klee and the idea of taking a line for a walk. So you know, I've been walking along and there's a line. And then you start, oh, what about the time? Well, didn't go from time A to time B. It was just part of my life, but still. That was that. So this corresponds to a little bit of duration.
Responds to, but it's not, yeah, okay.
It's not exactly the same.
One more from the Zoom chat. So Dan Drake says, I should preface this by saying I'm an art practice-based PhD student at DJCAT, which may shed light on my question. And the question is, how much does the form or mode of knowledge, or the form of wisdom, shape our perception or reception of it?
Sorry,
how much does the form or mode of knowledge, or the form of wisdom, shape our perception or reception of it? It, I presume, is the world.
Oh, the world, yes. Okay, so it's not the knowledge itself. I was getting. So how does the form of knowledge or wisdom shape our perception of the world? I think I'll respond by saying that knowing, certainly with wisdom, is our perception of the world. Let's say that and what we're calling knowledge grows out of our perception of the world. That's a kind of phenomenological Merleau-Ponty kind of position, which would say that our involvement with the world is pre-objective. It's not me here in the world there, but me and the world as a field, a relational field of some kind, which contains within it possibilities for growth. And out of that, it's like plants growing out of the soil, out of that grows a number of things. It grows maybe knowledge, yes, for certain forms of knowledge, but also certain modes of attention, depending on the kinds of practices I'm involved in. I learn, I learn to attend to this or that. So if I'm a carpenter, I learn to attend to the grain of wood. If I'm a musician, I learn to attend to pitch, tiny variations of pitch, that sort of thing. I think we have to be a bit careful when we talk about perception of the world. It's imagining, well, here am I perceiving, and there's a world out there, and my perception is this is the classical way in anthropology when we used to talk about worldviews. You know, you say, well, there's these people who've got this worldview, and those people have got that worldview, and so these people are seeing the world in one way, and those people are seeing the world in another way. And that, I'm sure, is to get things upside down, with a horse, or whatever the right metaphor is, because it's really the other way around. I think that's right. Yeah.
So we end the Q&A as we end it with Indina Salva.
No. I think I should not ask.
No. I thought it was a nice. Sorry, well, I was happy about it.
I thought of the point ages ago, so it's probably coming in. All right, okay. So I was just thinking when you were speaking about care and the importance of kind of not eliding the human and, or humans. I guess I just wondered as well, I mean, there's such traditions of care which are partly biblical, which are to do with, being the custodian of, but it seems to me that just as your account of attention really is provoking us to expand or shift what attention or attentiveness might be, that This is a sense of care that begins as the responsibility.
Well, the key point there is, I think, go into it here, is that to care, like for another person, is to be cared for. And that this is against the sort of professionalization of care, in which you have people called carers and people who are cared for, or people, whatever it is. And I think what I would be wanting to say is that care is a bit like holding hands. So you've got a parent and a child, they're holding hands. And you say, who's holding whose hand? Is it the parent who's holding the child's hand or the child who's holding the parent's hand? And obviously it's both. And you think, well, it's the same with care. I mean, it's a silly question in a way to say, is it, which of these two, the parent or the child, is the carer? They're both caring for each other. And therefore care is intrinsically reciprocal in that sense. And I think that just recognition of that point, that is namely that there's a responsiveness intrinsic to care, has rather critical implications. In fact, I was writing a foreword recently for a book written by an young Australian anthropologist, which is a study of an Australian care home, an ethnographic study of an Australian care home and the problems they have with the carers and these old people who are sometimes a bit unpredictable in their behavior. And this issue was really central to it. And that back in their families, the old people could feel that although they were being cared for by children, maybe older relatives, that they were also caring as well as being cared for. But when they're stuck in the institution, they suddenly in which they were being cared for by carers, and they couldn't do any caring themselves. And this was a real problem.
Well, it's now time to thank all of you for your contribution to the discussion, and let us all collectively thank Tim Ingold for this wonderful and engaging.